Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab, the final Policy Lab for 2019. Today we will discuss the PA's recent call for elections, presidential and legislative elections. And so we will discuss the likelihood of these elections, what are their implications, and whether they're necessary given the current Palestinian leadership crisis, and how can we ensure that these elections are democratic, free, and representative of the Palestinian people. Before we go into discussion, I would like to welcome our two speakers. We have with us Omar Shaban. He's a policy advisor for Al-Shabaka, and he's the founder and director of the Gaza-based PAL Think for Strategic Studies. It's an independent think tank. He's an analyst of the political economy of the Middle East and a regular writer and commentator for Arab and international media. He's also the founder of Palestinian Groups for Amnesty International and the deputy head of the board of Atala, an association promoting microfinance for women, and a member of the Institute for Good Governance. Our second speaker is Inès Razek, also a policy member of Al-Shabaka. She's an advisor on cooperation for sustainable development, focusing on public policies and intergovernmental cooperation. She holds a master's degree in public affairs from Sciences Po Paris. She previously worked with the UN and other multilateral institutions, and she's currently based in Ramallah, advising the Palestinian government. Thank you both, Inès and Omar. And to kick off our discussion, starting with the basic question of, do you think it's likely these parliamentary and legislative or presidential elections to take place, in fact, next year, as was announced previously a few months back?
So who starts?
Maybe you start, Inès.
Thank you. Just I wanted to clarify that I don't advise the government anymore. I'm independent and I work in civil society. So thanks a lot for inviting me here. I see a lot of people connected, so I'm very humbled, and that's nice. I hope it can be a very interactive discussion. I'm not an expert in this area, but I hope we can have a really sort of a collective exchange on this. So I think, I take this also from someone just based here and hearing what's the talk of the streets in Ramallah and around, and the West Bank. And I think there is, on the one hand, the willingness that the elections happen. We've seen negotiations among the two main factions, Hamas and Fatah, actually successfully coming to some agreements around the parameters of elections. And I think because the president of the PA and also president of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, is also being pressured by the international community. Especially, we see a lot of diplomats, coming and going and pressuring the PA to have these elections. So it seems on the one hand, it could really happen because of all these parameters, but on the other hand, there are a few conditions that might actually not permit the holding of these elections. So the PA has requested officially to the Israelis to hold elections in Jerusalem. And they will condition the holding of the elections to Jerusalemites being able to participate. And, in 2006, this had been allowed with a big pressure from the US. And obviously today we don't really foresee such a mediating role for the United States. So the question is, would that be the perfect excuse actually for not holding the elections? Because what we see is that actually the factions and the leadership is not so ready or keen in reality to have elections. So I think in a sense, to respond to the question, would it happen or not? There is no clear-cut answers, but we know what could be obstacles and pressures.
Thank you, Inès. So before we go into the challenges of holding these elections, I want to move to Omar to get his view whether he thinks that these elections would indeed take place next year as already announced. What do you think, Omar?
First of all, good evening to you and to everybody. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's my pleasure. And I think I have some sort of update on what's happening because I'm in Gaza. I was in Ramallah today and the last couple of days. And as a think tank, civil society, we are following this issue because it's very important. First of all, election is very necessary because it's our right as a citizen to have elected leadership. The whole political system in Palestine have expired by 2009. The last election for the presidency and the parliament happened in 2005. The President Mahmoud Abbas dissolved the PLC late last year, almost a year ago. So there is no any constitution in Palestine that legitimate. So everybody needs to renew its legitimacy. Hamas and Fatah and everybody. The invitation of the President Abbas to call for election was welcomed very warmly by the Palestinian people, despite the fact this is not the first time. This way, people are quite suspicious that is going to happen because there were some.
Omar?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I think we lost you for a second. Go on.
Both sides are more serious than before. Both sides have shown some compromises and some collaborative. I don't want to go into details until you want me to do so. The president agreed to do the parliamentary and president election, not at the same time, but within 3 months. This was the condition of Hamas. This is why it was rejected last time. Of course, there are many outstanding issues that each one is enough to destroy the whole thing. One of the key issues is Jerusalem, whether Israel will allow the election to happen in Jerusalem. There were some proposal. There were some ideas that the Israel will allow this to happen. There was a strong idea that Israel will not allow because the status of Jerusalem this time is not the same as 2006 when the Israeli allowed the election to happen. Only 5,000 Palestinian citizens from Jerusalem were allowed to vote at that time. I think if there is would be international pressure or consultation from the EU, from the Arab countries, this might happen. I don't see myself that Israel object this election. I think they are interested in empowering the Palestinian Authority and they have some sort of legitimate leadership. Of course, Israel will not say yes easily. We have noticed that Israel did not speak about it at all. They keep silent. Since the election, the idea of the election came in, there was no clear position from Israel. Of course, one of the other issues also that might hinder the process is
We lost Omar, I think.
Yeah, we're waiting for him to reconnect. I think he should be there. Omar, can you hear us? Okay, while he connects again, Inès, both you and Omar touched on a very important point, which seems to be like the biggest obstacle or elephant in the room, which is whether Israel will allow Palestinians in Jerusalem to vote, so whether elections will be held in Jerusalem. So do you think in case that Israel would not allow for such elections to take place, that the elections should go ahead nevertheless?
You're asking my opinion or if they will actually go ahead? Because I think if they don't allow, they will not go ahead. I think the PA will refuse to hold election without Jerusalem. And they have made that clear. Now, should they hold it? Well, I have my reservations on holding PA elections altogether, but without having PLO elections. No, I think obviously, just like we need to unify, I think have a national vision and unify the vision, we have to make sure that all citizens can vote. And that's not even the case in PA elections, right? Because you have all the refugees that are not included in the casting of their ballots, because it's about PA and not PLO. So we can talk about this later in this confusion. But in essence, I think it would be a mistake, but also, again, to me, it seems like it's the perfect excuse for the leadership not to hold elections overall.
Thank you, Inès. Omar, we lost you for a second, but we moved on to on the topic of whether Israel will allow for elections to take place in Jerusalem or not. And that leads me to my second question. So in addition to that foreseen obstacle, what would be other challenges to and impediments to holding these elections, and how can we overcome them? Omar, the question is for you. Omar, can you hear me? I think we're having technical problems. But maybe, Inès, I go back to you until I see till Omar can hear us.
Yeah, he's freezing as well, so I'm not sure. Oh, he's hearing us. Omar, can you hear us, and can you speak?
All right, so shall we continue then the discussion?
Okay, so you were asking about other obstacles to hold elections.
Yes.
Well, I mean, no, I think if Jerusalem, look, if in the case Israel would allow elections in Jerusalem, I think there is a likelihood that, PA elections would go ahead. Because as Omar said, one of the conditions of Hamas was not to hold elections at the same time and have so the Hamas accepted PA's demand to have elections separately, meaning that you wouldn't have PLC elections, the Legislative Council, and presidential elections at the same time. And after they accepted that, it seems that they've agreed on the different conditions. Again, this doesn't resolve the issue of the relationship between the PLO, which is the representative of the Palestinian people, to negotiate with Israel and to eventually, is the sole body that can actually negotiate with Israel a final solution and a peace agreement, and can actually have, has the mandate to hold a national, basically, vision and plan for liberation, what the PA doesn't have. But when it comes to PA, both the major factions have agreed. Then there is other obstacles when it comes to the democratic aspect of these elections. But when it comes to holding on paper and I think in practice, the Electoral Commission has been ready for a long time. In terms of logistics, in terms of registration of people, votants. So I think, eventually, if Jerusalem is accepted in the election, then for sure they could happen. That doesn't mean that they would be democratic or that they would allow the renewal of the leadership, but they could happen. And people are very suspicious now. I think people are clearly pessimistic and cynical even, but people would go to vote, and I think a lot of people obviously would actually welcome to vote for the first time, because people below 31 basically have never had the chance to vote, and that's the majority of the population.
And what do you think is in it for Hamas and Fatah to actually agree on holding elections? Because obviously in the West Bank, at least, the Fatah has been enjoying having a sole grip on power, while it's the same case for Hamas in Gaza. And given what happened in 2006 and the aftermath in 2007, why would both of them now agree to hold elections? What do you think their motivations or maybe likely scenarios in case the elections indeed take place?
I think in principle, the current leadership and let's say the current leadership of Fatah and Fatah dominated PA institutions in the West Bank, and I will let Omar talk about Hamas to be honest, because I have less of a grip of what's going on in Gaza, and I haven't been able to go to Gaza in 15 years, so I don't have the pulse from what's going on there. But in the West Bank, no, they don't necessarily have an interest, but they see the pressure. I think they've been feeling the pressure. There has been no wins for the PA in the past years. The conditions on the ground are worsening. And people feel the economic pressures. Abu Mazen as the president is really, is not popular at all, and more than 60% of people want him to resign. So there's been that, and I think the international pressure has kind of worked, because the PA is dependent on international aid. Diplomats have been pushing for holding elections, not as a direct condition, but I think there is here some kind of informal conditionality that you should hold elections, because eventually the leadership and the government of the PA is not legitimate anymore and representative. So all of these factors, I think, have kind of created a bottleneck for the leadership to refuse and say no. And it's not the first time actually that Abu Mazen had somehow promised elections or announced elections. He announced them at the General Assembly, and for a while people were like, "Oh, okay, another announcement." But it seemed that then I think the conditions sort of came together, so that I think both could not sort of refuse to at least try. And I think that the Jerusalem issue is somehow also in the back of their mind, like the perfect excuse, because they know that in Israel the leadership and the current political dynamics are obviously very Netanyahu's positioning and the right-wing government are they would have no interest in allowing such a compromise, given the current dynamics and political tribes at play within Israel. So it seemed very unlikely that Israel would do such a compromise, which then might give the excuse not to hold these elections and again gain time. Yeah.
And so you mentioned one point that, of course, the elections would be used as an excuse to renew the legitimacy of the PA given the current leadership crisis. Before I move to our next question, I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please post them on the chat, in the chat box. And I want to see if we can still connect again with Omar. I know that you can hear us, but we would like to hear you. So if you hear us.
I hear you very well. I hear all the discussion.
Okay, so please join the discussions then.
I don't know what was the problem, but I'm with you.
Okay, well, apologies for the technical difficulty. Omar is based in Gaza, and therefore we're having these problems.
We are well connected.
Okay. So given the circumstances that we just discussed, Inès and Omar, do you think that the PA elections will actually be used as a vehicle for achieving Palestinian unity and democracy a decade after the Palestinian political division. Do you foresee that scenario taking place?
Actually, my answer would be no, because I think we have to. I think we have to remind that PA, generally what the PA is. I think we should bear in mind that I think confusing, and a lot of people confuse in the analysis and in the international scene. They compare actually, for example, what would be elections, and even some Palestinian leaders talk about this, right? There would be elections in the US, in Israel, and in Palestine in 2020. But we cannot put these on the same level, because at the end of the day, the Palestinian Authority is not a sovereign government. It was supposed to be a temporary authority, created under the Oslo Accords that were also meant to be temporary until there would be a final Palestinian state. And so today, the PA remains this, proto-state, this authority that has a very crippled sovereignty over Bantustans in the West Bank and over like isolated islands, across only 16% of the West Bank. And so eventually, I think we just have to remind what PA election means. PA election mean electing those the people who manage the day-to-day life of Palestinians living in the West Bank. They're a service provider, and they're those who manage West Bank and Gaza affairs. And because even in East Jerusalem, there is a PA minister of East Jerusalem, but in reality, obviously, there is a lot of crackdown on any PA or Palestinian representation whatsoever in Jerusalem. So I think bearing that in mind, we have to see that if there is a legislative council, let's say that's voted and that's at the proportional representation with other leaders, like with different leaders, and there is obviously a sort of a balanced representation between Hamas and Fatah. This will be only applying to, let's say, civil affairs in the West Bank. This will not be a body that will have a say in key issues, which is the relation with Israel, the national representation of Palestinian and the Palestinian people, wherever they are, meaning including the refugees, and agree on a constitutional umbrella that would be what is the social contract and what is the national vision we propose to the Palestinians. And I think that's broken. And I think without PLO elections at the same time, and without clarifying the relationship between PLO and PA that has absolutely been confused, and actually the PA taking more power than the PLO, this won't allow a democratic renewal and reconciliation. The other thing is that in case, imagine that in the presidential elections, which probably is unlikely, I would say would be unlikely to happen given the polls, but imagine a Hamas candidate. Hamas has indicated that they would like to propose a candidate, unlike in 2006 where they had boycotted the presidential elections. So if they if they present a candidate for presidency, imagine that this candidate wins, then you would have a divide between the PLO chairman, who's still Mahmoud Abbas, and that will not change for the time being, and you would have a PA president who's Hamas, and this will eventually create even more divide rather than reconcile, because you have, again, two very distinct visions, and it's not about ideology. I think when we talk about reconciliation and national unity, we should be very careful in the sense that we don't want to erase pluralism. I mean, there's a lot of people who come to us and say, yeah, but you cannot unite, and you disagree. I think disagreement is good. I think there will be different visions. I think there will always be somehow an Islamic movement. There will be a secular movement. There will be different ideologies, and that's that's what democracy is about. What is critical is that both factions don't come under a same constitutional umbrella. They don't agree on a similar social contract and a similar kind of national strategy for how we as Palestinian people, are actually driving to our self-determination, driving towards liberation, like have a common sense of basically basic rules and a basic a plan together, even if then that means different in ideologies of how that might look like, and strategies of how do we get there. So I think that's just what I wanted to remind of, and so I think the answer would be no.
I mean, I'm totally on the same page with you. I think if we want to get our political house in order as Palestinians, there are a matter of priorities. And to me personally, I also think that the PLO should be, there should be elections first, because it is the main representative of all Palestinians. And then going into the PA, which represents Palestinians living in the occupied territories. I mean, I'm just... One of the questions, I mean, usually in the policy labs, we have questions left to the end, but I received one question and I also have the same question in mind, so maybe I'll just ask it now, is that how do we ensure, or what are the prerequisites in order not to have the 2006 scenario again? So let's just assume that Hamas wins again. So how would Fatah let go of their power? What do we need to, as Palestinian people, to ensure that the scenario of 2006 does not repeat again? What do you think, Inès?
Yeah, I'm just saying, Omar. Okay, he's saying it's very bad, so he shouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, unfortunately, Omar, we're so sorry to lose you in this discussion.
I think it's look, it's a good question. I think both factions, and actually it's right to call them factions and not parties. Unfortunately, they're not parties or political parties in the definition of political parties anymore. They're really factions. It's become, it's become a matter of really, it's not tribal, but really like this clientelism in politics, where it's about personalization of power, like sort of buying like social peace and the consent of people, a lot of corruption, obviously. But so I think the conditions are not there so that actually both groups would accept the results of the elections, and let alone the international community, because I think the international community is still battling with the fact that, okay, if Hamas wins again, how to not make the same error of 2006 and boycott them. And then here we are, in this dire situation where you have Gaza people who have to suffer more than 12 years blockade and basically boycott, let's say. I think the conditions to, I think there needs to be a complete shift in the leadership of these factions, which is not again happening anytime soon. There is very little space that is given to younger candidates, or younger candidates are sort of continuing the same line of the old leadership, which means that generally people don't recognize themselves in actually neither Hamas or Fatah. And that creates a thing where basically it will not be the people deciding, it would be eventually pre-written that the same kind of candidates and the same kind of leaders would eventually be elected. And you can see that it's the same people who can't agree right now to do, a national government, to reconcile and, try and have an interim government together. I don't see elections changing that, because the personality and nature of candidates who would present themselves would have the same type of approach than old candidates. So I think, right, it would be either status quo, whether there is, where there is like kind of a tacit agreement that Hamas would then, rule in Gaza and then Fatah in the West Bank. But this would be not the base of the democratic vote, but more of an arrangement between the factions, which is what is happening already. It's discussions, it's backdoor negotiations, it's agreements among personalities and among small groups of rulers, and that's. I wouldn't see how a vote could actually change that.
I agree with you. I think it's sharing the political pie and ensuring that everybody, basically what we have right now, the two main actors, Fatah and Hamas, agreeing among each other, how do they, divide that cake and ensure everybody's happy, which is not the exercise of democratic elections, where Palestinians have a say in electing people they want to see as their leaders, probably even outside of prism of Fatah and Hamas, because of the political fatigue that we have right now, and especially because of the leadership crisis. The people have lost trust, both in the Fatah-led PA in the West Bank and also in Hamas government in Gaza. And so this leads me to the question of, do you see the possibility of new Palestinian candidates or like Palestinian leaders emerging, particularly young Palestinians who are active on the ground, participating in these elections? And if not in these elections, what are the challenges of emerging leaders coming forward, and how can we also thinking for the future of building a democratic Palestinian governance system, how do we overcome these challenges?
So, big questions. Again, I don't have the answers. I'll just try and see my reading of things, and then we can hear from other people. But basically, the space, the democratic space, that is broken. So I think the obstacles are very real for younger candidates with a different vision, people who would like to see unity, people who would have, a certain ideology, actually an ideology for, socioeconomic issues, which both parties don't really have. They have always bet on liberation as an ideology, but not really an ideology on the ground for what kind of society we want. And candidates who don't recognize themselves, again, not candidates, but citizens who don't recognize themselves in the two factions, have a lot of obstacles if they would want to get engaged. And I would say different things. One, if we see actually the university elections as kind of a pulse and an example of some of the few elections that have been taken place just on top of municipal elections a few years ago. Well, in universities, what you see is that indeed the show is between the two big factions. Students go to vote, but that doesn't mean that they recognize themselves in these parties. Again, what's at play is that you have this patronizing and this patron factor where you have a lot of students who like, well, if I get involved with either or, then maybe I will be helped to find a job, or it will be easier for me to have connections and wasta and get in to some a job after school, or help my family in one sense or another if we have problems with Israelis or whatnot. So that's the dynamic. That's how a lot of young people just enter politics, right? And that's very broken because it becomes a mafia system. And on the other hand, you have those who might want an alternative, and activists, and those you can see who want to be active differently, who don't agree on both approach. And well, it's a dangerous endeavor. you know, you're either arrested by the Israelis or questioned by the PA, and you will be surveilled, and you know, your life might be at risk. And so that's the reality here as well, is that if you really want to enter the political scene, it's a risk, because you know, you might ask for ending Oslo or changing Oslo, but the fact and the matter is that PA functions only because of Oslo right now. And so it's there is a lot of concentration of power and security apparatus that also is, I think, preventing this kind of alternative to emerge. And the third thing is, I would actually say that a lot of people don't want to enter politics. You know, people have they despise the word. You know, it has, you know, politics should be a noble cause, but I think that's everywhere in the world, right? I think people distrust politicians, they distrust politics. You have people who now care about their livelihood, you know, they care about having a job and feeding their family before entering politics. So that's also a factor where any alternative, there is no alternative that's offering that to the people. People look first and foremost at what will bring them a job. And you can see that the left, you know, the left parties, so obviously you have, you know, like the FPLP, which is feeling, I mean, experiencing a lot of pressure from Israel, and, you know, being listed as a terrorist organizations outside, and a lot of their members arrested, like Khalid al-Jarrah, and so you know, they face a lot of, obviously, pressure and impediments to even develop, you know, an alternative programs and candidates, and then you have the sort of the other left parties that have a very difficult time in again unifying, proposing a vision, and that's again not only in Palestine, that's everywhere in the world, where we are in a moment where the left is a bit dead. And they have a very hard time to propose, I think, a compelling vision, and also propose candidates that would seem to be able to have the power to change things. So that's also a question, again, of power dynamics and personalities within the system we live in here.
Indeed, I think one of the preconditions for having fair and free elections is to have a democratic playing field where everybody is able to participate in that political process in a democratic and free manner. And unfortunately, right now we're witnessing an extremely shrinking space, particularly for activists and civil society organizations, as well as for media, to take part in that elections. And so I don't also, from my end, foresee how the elections would take place and how we would use the elections to overcome the current leadership crisis next year. We have Omar again. I hope maybe it works this time to, in the last 15 minutes, that you could join us in this conversation. We have received 4 questions from our audience, so I will just propose these questions for both you. But maybe I'll start with you, Inès. You mentioned and you talked about the PLO elections. So could you speak more about these elections, what they could or should involve in order to move Palestinian liberation forward?
Yes, I mean, I think so. Wait, I'm just checking if no, he's frozen again. So I think, to be honest, this is the major crux and the center node of the problem. You know, the PLO is the organization that's supposed to represent all Palestinians and have a vision towards Palestinian self-determination. And that took the form of ensuring, you know, the creation of a state. And when the PA came in after the Oslo Accords, sort of that relationship sort of turned, you know, the PA became the one with financial means and with donations from international community and with the bureaucracy and somehow holding the power when it comes to also relations with Israel. The problem is that the PA inherently, in itself, it's not about the people in it. It's about the system itself, which has absolutely no sovereignty and no capacity, mandate, and power to somehow propose a new national vision and a new national plan for liberation. I think most of the Palestinians now agree, and there is a consensus that Oslo is dead, that the negotiations didn't lead anywhere. Occupation and colonization is worse than ever. Fragmentation is worse than ever. Generally, the control of Israel's regime over the Palestinians is full, including over the PA. So I think first and foremost, the question is about the PLO representativity and reform, but doesn't obviously seem to be in the picture. And this is where then it subordinates, national interests to transactional ones. And you have a large part of the Palestinian community abroad, especially refugees, who cannot participate to the democratic process. It's only about who's residing in the Palestinian occupied territory. And as I said before, also obviously focusing this on the PA blurs this asymmetry between Israel and the Palestinians. Again, the PA is this sort of authority that's completely subordinate to Israel's control and the protocols that they have signed that Israel is not even respecting. So, if the PLO has, the Central Committee has even asked the Executive Committee multiple times to move away from Oslo, to move to a different approach and to move to a different national plan for Palestinian self-determination, given the reality on the ground, which is basically a reality of apartheid, where you have just Israel controlling the Palestinians and having a different set of laws for either you're in Jerusalem or the West Bank or Gaza. So I would say this is actually the critical thing that obviously there is no interest from the leadership to change right now, and the capacity again of younger candidates and the renewal within the PLO leadership is extremely limited. So I see a danger in offering this image of let's do elections of the PA without touching at all the issue of PLO, because it will give this illusion of sovereignty that we absolutely don't have, and it will actually perpetuate the same system we're in right now, which is worsening every day for the Palestinians.
One likely scenario, speaking of the PLO, and also having in mind, at the end of the day, the main reason of having elections, as I said before, is to have that democratic rotation, is to ensure that Palestinians are able to elect their leaders, that there's a sort of accountability, that that the political process is ongoing in a way that when Palestinians see that the leadership is not serving them, and not serving the Palestinian cause, that they would be able to, refresh that and be able to hold their leaders accountable and be able to elect a new leadership that is able to indeed take the Palestinian cause forward and ensure that Palestinians have their fundamental rights protected and promoted. And now, in the likely scenario of having, let's say, a PA president that is different from that is from a different faction, for example, let's say Hamas, than the PLO chair, which is currently held by President Abbas, who has 3 to 4 hats, I think. I mean, he's a Fatah leader, he's a PA president, he's a PLO chair, and I think he's the head of also the security apparatus. So the question is, do you think, for example, that these two positions should be separated as a one way of how we can press forward with the PLO elections and potentially PLO reform to de-associate it from the PA?
Yes, I agree. And I actually read a few analysts I agree with that we should fully separate and avoid this confusion between the PLO and the PA. obviously, right now, given it's not, this is on paper, but in reality, you have, again, leadership and functions and power dynamics that make it very difficult for these two to be disentangled. When it comes to the security, forces of the PA, the relationship and the relation with Israel and the occupation administration, everything now is actually in the hands of the PA, when actually some of this relation that is not just about the current civil affairs and technocratic issues within the West Bank or Gaza should actually go to the PLO. So this disentanglement is necessary, but it's very difficult to implement. So I would say on paper, obviously, we should really separate the two, because the PLO should be the one, again, dealing with the political matters, the international representation, national representation, offering a national strategy for the way forward to get to our sovereignty and self-determination. But on the other hand, yes, people need day-to-day services, and there is absolutely no accountability. So I think people will also want elections for that, because even if it's about technocratic issues, and it should be about providing people with the services that they need. There needs to be accountability on that too. But we have to be clear that should be the PA role first and foremost right now, is to actually provide health, education, and the basic services for people living in the West Bank and Gaza. But obviously, at the end of the day, we are subject to who constructs the road, who gives the permits for constructing. All of this is Israel. And beyond Area A, then comes the issue of who holds the cards to propose a national strategy to face that, and to actually confront Israel in its discriminatory policies and approach.
To our policy lab end, but before we end, we have 8 minutes. It seems to me from this discussion, and also from my own reading of the situation, that we are indeed in some sort of a vicious circle. That in order to reform, and in order to have democratic elections, and also to reform the PLO or have PLO elections, you need the Palestinian leadership to move on that front. But at the same time, it's the same Palestinian leadership that has brought us to the point where we are right now. So it's a bit of a, as I said, of a vicious circle. And maybe to end this discussion, and I see from the chats, from the comments we get, there's lots of pessimism around these elections, and that the fact that they are meaningless, so to speak. So what would be the number one step or recommendation, or let's say hopeful thinking at this point, to break this vicious circle?
Well, that's the $1 million question. But definitely, I would say what's not the first solution to the problem is elections. Actually, we're taking the problem by its wrong side, or by the wrong, you have so many sides to our huge challenges. Taking it by the election string is not the right approach. I would say, indeed, it's about coming together for a national movement. And I think I don't disagree or agree. Some people believe in PLO reform. Some people believe in a new PLO overall. But it really has to do with a national movement. It really has to do with national representation of Palestinians towards a national project. What do we want as a Palestinian people, for so that we have justice, freedom, dignity, all this. The PLO is not answering that anymore at all, and the PA has taken over. So I think this is the major crux of the problem. Before doing PA elections, it's really about pushing in one way or another is the obstacles to new leadership to emerge, and that might not be through elections. That might be through people in the refugees and diaspora communities, people in even within Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, people from Gaza, and people actually trying to break down from this factionalism that has really constrained Palestinians to not to reclaim democracy. And I think we're not the only ones. You look at what's going on in Algeria, in Sudan. I think there is this feeling that people are just not heard. We just have more obstacles to, I think, uprise what's in so many senses.
Indeed, interesting. I mean, on a regional level, what's happening in Algeria now, the strong opposition of people to holding elections. It's the same what happened in Sudan. Also, people are opposed to having elections because they are afraid that elections are used as to, like another recycling exercise to bring people who were in power before again in power, and to give them also a cover of legality and legitimacy. So what is happening around the world, and particularly in our region and now in Palestine, poses a lot of questions about bringing us to the regional question of this policy lab: are elections necessary, or are they harmful given all the current circumstances? This brings me to an end to our policy lab. I want to thank you so much, Inès, for your insightful discussion, and I'm so sorry that Omar couldn't join us because of bad connection in the Gaza Strip. I want to remind everybody before we break off that this policy lab was made possible thanks to your generous donations. So if you would like to donate, there's a donate tab at the end at the platform. Thank you everybody for joining and for listening. I hope it was useful and interesting discussion for you as well as it was for me. And I wish you a happy holiday season, and thank you very much. Bye, Inès.
Thank you.